Still on the outline, Revelation 13, the two beasts, and we're going to pick up wherever we were on the, I think we're on page 2, but let me just summarize what we talked about last time. So there are two beasts in Revelation 13. That's the passage we'll be in, Revelation 13. The first beast is the beast from the sea, and we had talked about that and looked at the identification of that beast. That beast has a specific incarnation, basically, or specific referent, which is the person of Nero, the emperor who is alive during the time that the Revelation is being written. And the beast generically is the Roman Empire or the Roman power. And talked about the name on the forehead of the beast heads, the blasphemous names, and the name on the forehead of the prostitute. And then from that, we talked about the name on the forehead of the high priest in the Old Testament and the name on the forehead of the 144,000. And from there, we talked about what is the mark of the beast. And we concluded from that that the mark of the beast basically is having the beast's name on you. You know, it's on your hand and on your head. You think the way that the anti-God, anti-Christian society thinks, and you act that way too. That would be the mark of the beast. And that's because that's in contrast to the mark or the seal on the forehead of the people of God. And the seal on the forehead of the people of God goes back to Deuteronomy, where it talks about write these laws, put them on your forehead, put them on your wrist. And they are a sign and a seal that you belong to God and that you think God's thoughts after him and that you do in accordance with what God has said, the things that the things that you've been thinking about. There was one other passage that I wanted to talk about in that section that I didn't talk about before. So let's go there. It's in Numbers 6, 24 to 27. This will be a passage you've all heard before, at least the first two verses. Let's see. This is one of the most common benedictions that a pastor gives at the end of the service. So we'll start in 22. The Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron and his sons, this is how you are to bless the Israelites. Say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face towards you and give you peace. Then verse 27, so they shall put my name on the Israelites and I will bless them. And you can see how this passage is related to the discussion about the names on the beast and the woman and the people of God. God puts his name on his people through him pronouncing the blessing on them and their reception of that blessing. It is a mark of ownership, and it is also the direction for the people of God for their life. They belong to God. They will live according to what God has said. So that verse belongs with that discussion that we had there. We next talked about where one of the heads of the beast seemed to have a mortal wound, but the beast had revived. We talked about the various theories about what that might be. And my conclusion is that what's being talked about is Nero at his suicide in 68 AD, the empire nearly disappears. It goes into convulsions, and current historians, contemporary or within 100 years of that event, what they said was that everybody thought that the Roman Empire was going down for the count, that it was going to disappear and internally just fall apart. But after a year of extreme instability in which there were 3 other emperors who were all assassinated in the same year, Vespasian came to power in 69 AD and restored stability to the empire. And so that would fit the time frame that we're talking about for the Revelation, and also fits what that verse seems to be describing. And
basically, we would say that this Well, this beast we have previously identified, it's not Nero specifically, it's just the Roman Empire.
Yeah, the Roman Empire, of which Nero is one of the heads.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's one of the heads that's gets the mortal wound, and then it is actually one of the heads that appears to survive, or the beast survives the mortal wound. And so there were different explanations of that. It's interesting to note in all the different explanations, they end up, all of them end up referring to Nero, either Nero, before 70 AD, or the myth that Nero would return, that he actually wasn't killed, but that he would return, which allegedly arose sometime, right after Nero's death, and was still around even up to the 5th century. And or the views are about the Roman Empire, the Roman Empire of the 1st century, or in the dispensational view, this passage is about the Roman Empire in the future that's rebuilt. So we have all views end up going back to Nero and the Roman Empire, making it kind of an interesting discussion. Let's go to Revelation 13, and we'll read the passage for today. Today we're going to talk about the 42 months, and this is in Revelation 13. Start in verse 1. And I saw a beast coming out of the sea. He had 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 crowns on his horns, and on each head a blasphemous name. The beast I saw resembled a leopard, but had feet like those of a bear, and a mouth like that of a lion. The dragon gave the beast his power and his throne and great authority. One of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole world was astonished and followed the beast. Men worshipped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshipped the beast and asked, "Who is like the beast? Who can make war against him?" The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, and to exercise his authority for 42 months. He opened his mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. He was given power to make war against the saints and conquer them, and he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. All the inhabitants of the earth will worship the beast, all whose names have not been written in the book of life, belonging to the Lamb that was slain from the creation of the world. He who has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity he will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword he will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. So the terrifying beast that has these characteristics from the 4 beasts that Daniel saw in his vision is going to be given authority by God to make war against the saints and to overcome them for a period of time, which is here said to be 42 months. And this gets us back into the discussion of these time indicators in the book of Revelation and what they might mean. And I thought I would just group them all together in this section, and we can look at each one of them. So this 42 months, a period of 42 months is mentioned earlier in the Revelation. If we back up to chapter 11, verse 2, let's see what this is. We'll start in verse 1. I was given a reed like a measuring rod and was told, "Go and measure the temple of God and the altar and count the worshippers there, but exclude the outer court. Do not measure it, because it has been given to the Gentiles. They will trample on the holy city for 42 months. And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth." So the city will be trampled for 42 months. So there is, right here we run into one of the places where commentators differ. Are these 2 42-month periods that are being talked about in these 2 chapters, are they the same? In other words, is it just 2 different ways of describing the same period of time, or are these different periods of time? That's not even to address the question of, are these literally 42 months? And if it is literally 42 months, when did that happen? Or is this some symbolic number? Most people take numbers in the apocalyptic books of the Bible, like the visions of Daniel and Revelation and Zechariah, to be at least figurative or symbolic in some sense. Are they symbolic numbers or not? Are these time periods consecutive? There's going to end up being 5 or 6 time periods of roughly 3.5 years each. And if you run them consecutively, it's like 17.5 years or something. Anyway, people look at these and they wonder, how do we interpret them? Those are some of the questions that they think about. So what's happening in the first one, 42 months in chapter 11, is that the Gentiles are trampling on the holy city for 42 months. And the thing that's happening in chapter 13 is the beast is given authority to persecute the church and to overcome them. And just to read that again, chapter 13, verse 5. The beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise his authority for 42 months. He opened his mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. He was given power to make war against the saints and to conquer them. And he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nations. So we'll be in the book of Daniel before we're done today, but I just want to point out that in verse 7, every tribe, people, language, and nation is a phrase that comes out of the book of Daniel. It's used multiple times, and we looked at it before. It's just another link to the book of Daniel. Right now, I just want to go through these verses and kind of get it in our head, the different things are being talked about. And then we'll go back through them and maybe look a little bit deeper. So the 1260 days also comes up. That's point 2, and we read that in chapter 11. I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1260 days. So it's 11 verse 2, or 11 verse 3. In chapter 12, verse 6, a period of 1260 days is mentioned. Starting in verse, we'll start in verse 1 just to get the context here. A great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon under her feet and a crown of 12 stars on her head. So the Old Testament people of God, the Jewish people. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his heads. His tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky and flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that he might devour her child the moment it was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. This is the Messiah. That's a quote from Psalm 2 about the Messiah. So the picture is that the woman, the Old Testament people of God, are about to bring forth the Messiah. The dragon wants to prevent this, and so he is waiting for the Messiah to be born so he can kill the Messiah. But verse 5, the second part, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the desert to a place prepared for her by God where she might be taken care of for 1260 days. So this is the length of time then that God protects the woman, who is the church of God, from the attack of the devil. And she is in the wilderness. And these are all pictures, and the picture of the wilderness is typically a picture of being with God, but not being with God in the eternal city. Mm-hmm. It's being with God kind of in the world, moving through it. If you think about the Old Testament Exodus, it's a time of trial and testing, a time of waiting on God for his provision, and where we learn to trust in God. So during the period of time, 1260 days, the woman is in the wilderness. God is protecting her. And protection is from the dragon who's trying to destroy the woman, her child, and then as the chapter goes on, her other offspring as well, which would be people of the church. It's 1260 days. The next thing that's mentioned is in chapter 12, verse 14. We'll skip down to verse 13. And when the dragon saw that he had been hurled to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly to the place prepared for her in the desert, where she would be taken care of for a time, times, and half a time out of the serpent's reach. This seems to be the same period of time as what was described as 1260 days. It's just being said in a slightly different way, but it seems to be the same thing that's being spoken about. And so we have here maybe a link between these 2 periods of time. So, because they both describe the same thing as happening, and this also gives us, if we're trying to figure out exactly how long is a time times and half a times, and we think that the number 42 months is literal, then we have an identification there. 42 months is a time times and half a times, if we think it's literal. Or 1260 days, sorry, 1260 days, which actually turns out, if your month is 30 days long, turns out to be 42 months. The last passage is in chapter 13, verse 5, which we've read. It's the 42 months is the time that Nero, or the beast, is allowed to make war on the saints and overcome them. Now, that period that the beast is allowed to overcome the saints is referred to in Daniel 7. Let's go there. Let's go to Daniel 7. Look at that. So the beast, Daniel 7 is the vision of, or a dream of Daniel of the 4 beasts. And this is where the beast imagery comes from for the beasts in Revelation. Particularly the first beast in Revelation is just a conglomeration of these 4 beasts here. And everybody believes that the beast in the Revelation is ultimately the 4th beast, although he has characteristics of the other. If we go to verse 19, then I wanted to know the true meaning of the 4th beast, which was different from all the others and most terrifying, with its iron teeth and bronze claws, the beast that crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. I also wanted to know about the 10 horns on its head and about the other horn that came up, before which 3 of them fell, the horn that looked more imposing than the others, and that had eyes and a mouth that spoke boastfully. As I watched, his horn was waging war against the saints and defeating them, until the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom. He gave me this explanation. The 4th beast is a 4th kingdom that will appear on earth. It will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth, trampling it down and crushing it. The 10 horns are 10 kings who will come from this kingdom. After them, another king will arise, different from the earlier ones. He will subdue 3 kings. He will speak against the Most High and oppress the saints and try to change the set times and the laws. The saints will be handed over to him for a time, times, and half a time. But the court will sit, and his power will be taken away and completely destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, power, and greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be handed over to the saints, the people of the Most High. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all rulers will worship him and obey him. This is the end of the matter. I, Daniel, was deeply troubled by my thoughts, and my face turned pale, but I kept the matter to myself. So we've been in this passage before in this study. As we've noticed, Daniel is kind of a background book for the book of Revelation. It's one of the books that Revelation refers to over and over again. And I think the major structure of the coming of the kingdom of God spoken of in Daniel is actually what's happening in the book of Revelation, is that the Revelation is expanding on the visions of Daniel, giving more detail about the coming of the kingdom of God. And that happens in the first century, when the kingdom of God comes in the ministry of Christ. Christ is exalted as king. And then Revelation also speaks about the consummation at the end of history. But here, what we've just read about is one of the horns of the beast making war against the saints and being given the ability and allowance by God to overcome them and to conquer them for a short time, which is then designated as a time, times, and half a time. So we've come across that time designation before. That was the time that the church is nourished in the desert when the woman flees there from the serpent. In the Revelation, it's the 42 months that's talked about, the time that the beast is allowed to make war against the saints and overcome them. So here we have probably an identification then between these two time periods, these two time designations. And I don't want to make, there's interesting when you read the commentaries, some people spend a really long time trying to figure out what the numbers mean. And other people are just content to say, we don't know, they're probably symbolic. And then the only thing I'm actually concerned about is, are these all the same time period spoken of in a different way? In other words, is John using synonyms? Is he speaking synonymously? Or is there something significant that is linked to 42 months that's not linked to time, times, and half a time? But I think that this passage that we just read in Daniel would point towards synonyms, synonymous use, and not to each one has a special meaning. And so then the question then becomes, are we looking at symbols, which would be a perfectly legitimate question in the book of Revelation? Are we looking at symbols, or are these designating 1240 days or 1260 days exactly, something like that. And toward that end, I want to look at one other passage in connection with the, see if I can find it. Where is it? To the 42 months, particularly to the one as spoken of in Revelation 11:2, where the 42 months was the time that the holy city would be trampled by the Gentiles. In 42 months, the holy city will be trampled by the Gentiles. Let's look at Luke 21:24. And that's not in the outline, but you can write it down if you want. Luke 21:24. So starting in verse 20, speaking of the coming siege of Jerusalem, which occurred in 66 to 70 AD. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out. Let those in the country not enter the city. For this is the time of punishment and fulfillment of all that has been written. How dreadful it will be in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. There will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Here we have a reference to Jerusalem being trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Revelation 11:2 says that that time is 42 months. How are we to understand that? And Jerusalem is still not in the possession of the Jews, not fully. They don't have the Dome of the Rock. They can't build their temple. It's not fully in the possession of the Jews and has not been since 70 AD. That is not 42 months. That's quite a bit longer. So how are we to understand the 42 months? So one way to understand the 42 months, which I am persuaded by, is if we look at Romans 11, we might get some help here. Romans 11:25. Question that Paul is addressing starting in chapter 9 of Romans, he talks about it for 3 chapters, is since the gospel has gone to the Gentiles and the Jews have rejected their Messiah, does this indicate that God has rejected the Jews and put them aside forever and is only going to deal with the Gentiles? And Paul's answer to that is no. No, it doesn't indicate that at all. The calling of God and his gifts are irrevocable. God is faithful to his promise. And then what's happening in this period of time is that the gospel, and by this period of time, I mean the period of time in the first century when Paul and the other disciples basically said to the Jews, since you don't count yourself worthy to hear the good news from God, we're going to the Gentiles. And they wiped their feet, the dust off their feet, and they went to the Gentiles. And so that period of time, Paul says, what God is doing is the Jews have been hardened and they've rejected the Messiah and the gospel message. And so God has now sent that message to the Gentiles. And there is a number of people in the Gentiles, the elect of God, known from the foundation of the world, whom God will save through the preaching of the gospel. But when that preaching of the gospel is over, the time of favor shown to the Gentiles exclusively will be over, and God will turn, and the Jews, he says, and then all Israel will be saved. So we'll read that in chapter 11, verse 25. I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers, so that you may not be conceited. So he's writing to Gentile Christians. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And so all Israel will be saved. As it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will turn godlessness away from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. Paul says, and this is one of the things too, when people, well, I'll bring up that in a second, but Paul says, God has not rejected his people, not forever. God has turned his favor toward the Gentiles, and by his favor, what Paul means is God has sent the gospel to the Gentiles. This is the supreme proof of God's favor on a people, that they hear the gospel freely. And so Paul says there's a number of Gentiles, then they'll all be saved. And when that number gets to the full, the gospel will go back to the Jews. Now, we have gospel going to the Jews today. We have missionaries to the Jews. We've had missionaries to the Jews since about the 3rd century. But there has not been mass conversion. And what this passage talks about is then all Israel will be saved. Now, whatever a person might think about what the word all means there, it certainly means more than what we see now, which is basically a little trickle. And so Paul is saying at the end, there'll be mass. In mass, the Jews will come to Christ. Whether it's every individual or not is not the point, but that in mass, the Jews will come to Christ. As a side note, I just want to say, I want to point out here, and we talked about this a long time ago when we talked about the idea of imminency. Does the Bible teach that Jesus can return at any time? Paul's answer would be no. Paul would say, no, the fullness of the Gentiles has to come in, and Israel has to be saved, and then the Lord will return. That's what Paul's answer would have been. And that's consistent through the whole Bible. The modern doctrine of imminency is not actually what the Bible teaches. Jesus cannot return at any time. Peter certainly didn't think Jesus could return in his lifetime because Peter knew that Jesus had told him, you're going to die. And so Peter certainly didn't believe Jesus could come back at any time. He thought he had to die first. So, lots of things.
Of course, dispensationalists wouldn't agree with this.
No, but it is very
We don't
hard
need to bring that up.
Yeah,
The thing I was thinking.
It's difficult. It's hard to argue with the logic of the text.
Yeah.
But yeah.
You talked about missionaries in Israel, and I kind of never thought about that. We have missionaries all over the world in many countries, but I kind of never thought about the fact that there are also Christian missionaries in Israel.
Yeah.
And that may be what the Fellowship of Christians and Jews organization might be described as, but I'm not sure.
Mm. Yeah, one of the most fascinating books I've read, it's called The Puritan Hope, The Puritan Hope. And it's about the Puritan response to unfulfilled prophecy. And that's the subtitle. And the unfulfilled prophecy specifically that the book is about is this one that we just read, that all Israel is not saved, that the fullness of the Gentiles have not come in. And it was the Puritans who in the 17th century were the first to really organize what we would say is modern missions to the Jews. They said this prophecy will be fulfilled, and we want a part of it. So they started organizing and sending people to the Jews who were scattered throughout the world, and trying specifically to evangelize the Jews. And just a fascinating book. And so the outreach to the Jews. So what happened in the early church, generally speaking, is that the Jews were seen as, the Jews were the problem. They were the persecutors of the early church, and they were the ones that rejected the Messiah, and they're the ones that killed Stephen in the church, the early church leaders and things like that. And so every time they were approached with the gospel, it was met with hostility. So the gospel, the early church basically didn't do a lot of efforts to the Jews because they saw the resistance, and they also saw the biblical pattern where Paul said, we've been trying to bring you the gospel for a couple of years now, and you guys are trying to kill me, so I'm just going to not do this. But by the time we get to the 16th century, there's a revival because of the Reformation just preceding that, because of the printing press just preceding that, where biblical knowledge is at an all-time high. People have read their Bibles, they've been instructed well, and the emphasis turns to missions, and turns to missions to the Jews, because they read this prophecy and other ones too, and they go, well, God's going to fulfill all his promises, and we want a part of that. And just an awesome attitude, actually. So back to the text, and back to unless somebody has anything to say. Does anybody have anything to say?
Yeah. I could say something on the missionaries over in Israel. I went over there in 2011 on a mission trip, 3-week mission trip. And of course, we saw the normal parts of Israel that people on the regular trip see, plus other parts. But anyway, when we were outside of Tel Aviv there, where Jerusalem is and all that, if we were walking down the street of going to our mission, area, people would come up to us and ask us why we're in Israel. And we'd have to tell them we're here to visit. Because if we told them we were here on a mission trip, they would send us on a plane and send us back home. We wouldn't be allowed. And the people who are missionaries over there, they go underneath the ground in caves to teach, so they can't be seen, and so the Bibles can't be seen. And as a matter of fact, I was even walking down the street eating an ice cream one day, and this lady comes up to me and says, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I'm here to tour Israel." "Oh, okay," but I had to keep my Bible here. I could not show my Bible, so I had one of those little pocket Bibles that they couldn't see, so yeah, so it's really, there are missionaries over there, but they have to stay well hid, or else they'll be either killed or sent back to where they came from.
Yeah,
and this was in 2011.
Yeah, I think conditions are the same. Mom.
So the missionaries that we're talking about to Israel aren't all in the land of Israel, though.
No, no.
It's the setting out of the gospel to the Jews all over the world.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Good motivation, I think. So the trampling of the holy city. So back to the 42 months, and if it is related to what we just read in Romans 11, the trampling of the holy city by the Gentiles. That's how the 42 months is described in Revelation. The Luke 21 passage says that the city will be trampled until the time of the Gentiles is over. Most interpreters, when they read Luke 21 and they're talking about the trampling of the city, think about it in the terms that I first expressed, why the city is still being controlled partially by Gentiles. And they interpret the city as the literal city of Jerusalem. But I think there is an argument that can be made for interpreting the Olivet Discourse, which is what that is. That quotes from the Olivet Discourse, the words of Jesus about the coming destruction on the city, that Jesus is talking in covenant terms. He's talking about the favor of God and the blessing of God and the coming realization of the covenant curses on the people of God for their resistance to God and the killing of his messengers and the killing of the Messiah, and that the covenant is about spiritual blessings, it's not so much about the physical city, but the favor of God being expressed to the people. And the favor of God is expressed to the people in the preaching of the gospel. And the disfavor of God is expressed in the pronouncement of the covenant curses and in the bringing upon them on the covenant curses. So looked at that way, it doesn't seem unreasonable to think that the time of the Gentiles that Luke is speaking about is the time of favor toward the Gentiles, where the gospel is not specifically going to the Jews with effectiveness, but is going to the Gentiles with effectiveness by the work of the Spirit. And if that's what Luke is talking about, because if you interpret it if you interpret it about the physical city, you get a really, really, really long 42 months. Turns out if you interpret it spiritually, you get a really, really long 42 months also. But it ties in with this passage in Romans 11 about that time of the Gentiles coming to an end someday, and then God returning with favor to the Jews. So anyway, I thought I'd kind of bring those two passages together so that you could think about it and see what you think about it. I lean pretty strongly toward the time of the Gentiles that Luke is speaking about is not about the physical city, but about the favor of God. And but in either case, we get to the 42 months as being symbolic for the trampling of the city. There's no way that it could be not symbolic there. So then you have to wonder about, that brings up other questions. So back on the outline, that brings up other questions about these time periods. If you see on page 3, I have under number 5 there, 42 months. I have italicized note there that Nero's persecution lasted just this amount of time, from mid-November 64 to June 9th, 68. That's a period of 42 months. A lot of people point that out. And this assumes that, of course, that the 42 months is literal and not symbolic, or that it is maybe a time period that is flexible. So what have we accomplished by looking at these time periods? We have exactly the same questions we started with, I think. I don't think we've answered any question. I think we've tied some things together, and then you look at them all together as a group and go, Not sure how that works. So I don't want to be dogmatic about any of these time periods. That's been my consistent viewpoint throughout the revelation so far, is that, I'll be dogmatic about soon, near, and at hand. I think those are written in non-visionary portions of the work. They are written directly and didactically to the readers, meant for their encouragement. But when we read things like 42 months, 1260 days, a time times in half a time, I'm not sure that the early readers are supposed to understand anything except for it's temporary. So, because these are in visionary sections, apocalyptic sections that are highly symbolic, it's likely they're symbols. But it does seem that some of them are not symbols. So, hard to know how to interpret them, especially when some of the same terms are used interchangeably with other terms. So I guess I'll say this lastly, and then we'll move on to the next point on the outline. One of the popular ways, or one of the attractive ways of thinking about the time periods, is to say, if it says 42 months, it's about persecution. And if it says 1260 days, it's about ministry, or something like that, some general characteristic. But even when you look at them carefully, it still doesn't work exactly right. So hopefully you weren't thinking, yay, finally we're going to figure these things out, because I could force it and make it say something, but I don't want to do. Nobody wants to do that. You want to look at it honestly and say, well, this is all I know about it right now, and what I know about it right now is not the most helpful, except to say we still have questions. So thanks for your patience as we work through that. We have just time a bit to talk about point E on page 3. So going back to Revelation 13, let's look at that. So you remember what's just happened in Revelation 13. The beast has appeared. It's been described. It's been given power and authority by God, even though his power ultimately, or is coming through the devil. The dragon gives him his power and authority, but God has said also to give him 42 months to do what he's going to do and give him the authority to do that. And what he is given authority to do is make war on the saints and overcome them. It's the language of Daniel 7. And then there's a command to the church, a word to the church in verse 9. He who has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to go into captivity he will go. If anyone is to be killed with the sword he will be killed. This calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. The people being addressed here are God's people. The people who are going to go into captivity and be killed with the sword are God's people. This is part of the overcoming of the saints. So the word to God's people by God, from God, is, if you're going to go into captivity, if you've been designated, determined, decreed by me to go into captivity, you will go into captivity. Not literal. It's quoting an Old Testament passage, but in the new setting, if something bad's going to happen to you, something bad's going to happen to you. If you're to be killed, you're to be killed. And so this calls for, it says, patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. This calls for the opposite of panic. This calls for absolute settled conviction that you are in God's hands. And so this calls for a calm endurance and faithfulness. God says, this is the end. I will bring you into my heavenly kingdom, and for some of you, this will mean death by the sword. Keep your eyes on the goal. For the joy set before you, endure what you're going to endure, and you will be rewarded after a short time of suffering, 42 months. After a short time of suffering. And so the call is for faithful endurance. This is such a blessing that God tells his people, It's going to be hard. Some of you will die. That is such a blessing for them, because they know then that they have to really settle it in their hearts and in their minds that I believe so much in the promises of God that I will live my life faithfully, even though I don't have the realization of those promises yet. I will live my life faithfully, and God will be good to his word, and he will take care of me. And if this is the path, then this is the path. This is the path God set out for me. This is the path I will walk. It's a whole lot easier to face difficulty if you know you're going to face it. It's a lot harder if it just sneaks up on you and surprise, here I am. So yeah, Mom.
This is reminiscent to me of Psalm 112. This is what God is telling his people that they should be like. And when you get down to verse, I'll start with 5. Good will come to him who is generous and lends freely, who conducts his affairs with justice. So he's talking about a godly man.
Mhm.
Surely he will never be shaken. A righteous man will be remembered forever. He will have no fear of bad news. His heart is steadfast, trusting in the Lord. His heart is secure. He will have no fear. In the end, he will look in triumph on his foes.
Right.
I just
Amen.
love that song.
Yeah, there's yeah, it's fantastic. I was thinking about he will have no fear of bad news.
Mhm.
In relative to what the good news is, what could be bad news?
And this man has no fear of bad news because, as one other translation states, he has settled in his heart that God will take care of him.
Right. Yeah, yeah, it's not just an
Right.
intellectual affirmation. It is the actual, it is the disposition of your heart, of your being, of your person. You say, I sit here in God's care and I will not be moved, because God is
Right.
unmovable. Right. So yeah, thank you, Mom. Good passage.
Here's Stephanie.
Oh, Stephanie, hi.
Thank
See you
you.
there. I see you there.
Yes, I'm here. I have an incredible story that just falls in line with those Bible verses so perfectly.
Okay.
One of my closest friends in high school, she got married in 2017-ish, and then a couple months after she got married, her husband was diagnosed with cancer, and he kept a blog of everything he was going through. But in every single post, it was talking about how God is just so good, how he's just taking care of him, taking care of the people around him. And all of his posts had so many Bible verses, and he wasn't afraid at all. He was so thankful for what he was going through. He passed away in March, but he, right to the end, he was just like, this is so good. I'm so grateful for this, even though it's hard, I'm so grateful. And it just reminded me so much of those verses.
Yeah. Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, good.
It was incredible I couldn't read all of it because it was so overwhelming how incredible it was.
Yeah.
This testimony. But I felt really blessed reading it. And I'm sure the people who knew him felt that way too.
Yeah. Well, I think also that it's always true of a Christian that when this worldly existence, this worldly life gets threatened, that our instinctual response by the Spirit is to look at what God has promised us and to cling to those things and to release the things, that are that we are tying ourselves to here, and to say these things are temporary. That's eternal. I'm going to hold on to what's eternal. And so the things of, as the psalm, not the psalm, as the song says, right? Fix your eyes on Jesus, right? And then the things of this world, right? I don't remember exactly, but fade away, I guess. What is it, Mom?
Grows strangely dim
Yeah.
in the light of his glory and grace.
Yeah. That is the true representation of what happens to Christians. And yeah, so Christians are called, these Christians in the first century are called to a hard path. But it's no different than the path Jesus walked.
Right.
And the fact that Jesus has walked, let's look at that passage I quoted. It's Hebrews 12, verse 2. Let's go to Hebrews. We just have a couple of minutes. We'll end here. Hebrews 12, 2. Verse 1. After talking about all the saints of God who were faithful but did not receive the promises, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinful men, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. It goes on and talks about God is treating you as members of his household, sons and daughters, so we're to endure hardship. But the part that is amazing to me, relevant to the discussion, Jesus saw the cross clearly, and he did not shrink away from it because he saw behind the cross the things that God had promised to him, all symbolized, all summarized by sitting down at the right hand on the throne, all summarized by that. Right. And so for the joy set before him, and what does this include? This includes, the joy set before him includes the reception of a people that the Father would give him, who would be his, who he would sanctify, justify, and sanctify, and glorify. All these people, us, he, so for that joy set before him, he endures the difficulty, the cross. And it's shameful, the cross is, and he despises the shame. He scorns the shame, endures the cross. He says, I don't care about the shame, the embarrassment, the stigma. Early Christians are persecuted and hunted as criminals, but their eternal reward is ahead of them. And they're being called to do exactly what Jesus did. The writer of the Hebrews is writing to people in that area at the same time period and saying this to them. Jesus is our example. He was promised these things by the Father. He did not receive them on earth. He had to go through the cross, and he did it not. I mean, it's interesting. He uses run with perseverance. The picture is, although historically this is not accurate, the picture is Jesus is running toward the Father, and the cross is in the way, and he has to go through it. He has to go through it, but he is so joyful at being received with joy in the Father's kingdom and in the household and receiving the promises that God has given him, that he's completely willing to go through the cross. And because at the end, he's seated at the right hand of the Father. So the call to the early Christians and the call to us is to live the same way, right? This is why Paul talks about, we set our minds on things above because our citizenship is in heaven and not here. This is what this picture in Hebrews is about too. That Jesus is not, he's going through the shadow of the valley of the shadow of death. He doesn't fear any evil because at the end he gets to sit down at a table And not just the table with his enemies, but at the very end with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and all the others in the kingdom. And he actually gets to sit at the head of the table on the throne. So anyway, this is the picture that is applied to Christians too. And in the first century, this is why it's good to know that in this world you'll have tribulation. And it's good to know that Jesus has overcome the world and that he is with you.
Yeah.
Because if you don't know those things, then it takes you by surprise and you're knocked off, following him. It sets you back and you have to reevaluate everything. But we don't actually have to reevaluate anything. We just have to look at Jesus and say, look, he did this already and he got what the Father promised. I am in Christ. I'm united to him by faith. My walk will not be any different. And my faith, my trust, my confidence in the Father should not be any different. And not only that, I have an advantage because Jesus is with me. So it's a really great lesson. And the passage in the Revelation 13 basically says things are going to get bad. So he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Right? Doesn't explain things are going to get bad, so you should focus on the eternal kingdom. But it says he uses the same thing that's at the end of every letter and the same thing that Jesus used to talk about his parables. If you've got ears to hear, then hear. Listen, pay attention. There's a spiritual lesson here. And the lesson is, this is not the whole story. The bad things that are going to happen, that's not the end. That's not the story. That's the little, it's the curtain that you go through. And on the other side is glory. So, anyway, so on Thursday, we'll pick up at the same place and we'll look at the passage in Jeremiah that's being quoted. Mom, you want to say something?
Yes. I just want to complete the thought about the song that you were quoting.
Yeah.
So I just want to quote the whole verse. Turn your eyes upon Jesus. Look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace.
Yeah.
The hymns that are still in our hymnals from, that were written hundreds of years ago and are still in our hymnals, they're there because they're biblical. They're so good.
They are.
They repay careful reading and thinking about. So thank you for sharing that, Mom. So it's 10:34. I should stop talking. Does anybody have anything else you want to add before we end?